Assalamu alaikum. May peace, blessings, and mercy of Allah be upon you and to all the messengers of Allah, and in particular on the noble and final messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his family, and his companions. Let me present to you the third lecture video series of CIA Part 2 Practice of Internal Auditing for all the exams beginning in 2020. We will continue our topic of section A, managing the internal audit activity in this video and will complete this section. Who should perform the third party audit? A third party audit may be performed either by internal auditors or by an independent auditor. The decision whether to internally or to contract for the third party depends on several factors. What is the total quality management? The total quality management pursues the approach of right first time and zero tolerance of waste with the objective of both increasing revenue through improved client satisfaction and decreasing costs with improved efficiency. Continuous improvement is one of the internal audit's key objectives, and therefore the internal audit activity has a critical role in TQM. Teamwork, training, empowerment, and innovation are vital components of total quality management. What are the advantages of a properly implemented and effective TQM? A properly implemented and effective TQM should result in A. Higher customer satisfaction, B. Fewer defects and thus less waste, C. Improved total productivity, D. Reduced costs and therefore better profitability. What is due diligence assurance engagements? Due diligence assurance engagements are often performed for a potential acquisition, joint venture, or divestiture. The purpose of the engagement is to validate the reasons for making the transaction or identify problems that need to be resolved before undertaking the transaction. External professional advisors usually are part of the team, often leading it. What is a physical security audit? A physical security audit ensures that an organization's physical facilities are adequately secured and that the environment is safe for management and the staff. The audit includes perimeter security, proximity security, and physical security of the premises. What is a perimeter security auditing? Perimeter security auditing requires a review of the property boundaries and a boundary risk assessment, including documenting risk on a site map. What is a proximity security auditing? Proximity security auditing determines how vulnerable company buildings are by being near certain items or structures. What is a privacy audit engagement? Privacy concerns exist in all aspects of an organization, from its paper based records to its internal databases to its policies of data collection on its website. Internal auditors need to make sure that personal information is protected from unauthorized access, both from inside and outside the organization. Furthermore, policies should be in place in line with all the applicable laws to specify the appropriate instances where disclosures can be made with or without the individual's consent. What is a financial audit engagement? A financial audit tests the reliability and integrity of reported financial information and determines the degree to which the company's assets are adequately safeguarded. What is an audit risk? Audit risk is basically a function of three things: inherent risk, into the control risk, into the detection risk. Inherent risk cannot be influenced because these are risks that are part of the item being tested. Control risk cannot be influenced in the current period because the audit covers events that have occurred in the past. In other words, controls were already either functioning or not functioning at the time of the transactions. Detection risk is the only one of the three risks that the auditor can directly influence. To determine the acceptable level of detection risk, the auditor should begin by assessing inherent and control risk, then solve for detection risk using the audit risk formula. Once the detection risk is calculated, then the auditor will be able to determine the nature, extent, and timing of the audit procedures to be performed. What is the relationship between the control risk and the detection risk? Control risk and detection risk are inversely related. What are financial statement assertions? Assertions are the claims that the management makes when it represents financial information and the auditor determines if the assertions are correct. Therefore, most of the work in a financial audit is spent on evaluating and forming an opinion about the management assertions. There are the five assertions. Number one, completeness. Financial statements contains all the required information and no material financial information has been omitted. Number two, rights and obligations. Everything that is reported as an asset represents something that the company has right over, and everything reported as a liability represents a real obligation. Number three, valuation or the allocation. Items reported in the financial statements are valued at the correct amount, and income statement items have been allocated to the proper period. Number four, existence or the occurrence. All the balance sheet items exist and all the income statement items occurred during a relevant period. Number five, statement of presentation and disclosure. The formal organization and classification of accounts on the financial statements and disclosures in the accounts, footnotes, and accounting policies conform to the general accepted accounting principles. What is an environmental audit? An environmental audit is a systematic, documented, periodic, and objective evaluation of how well an entity, its management, and its equipment are performing with regards to safeguarding the environment through facilitating management control of environmental practices and assessing compliance with entities, policies, and the external regulations. Define consulting services. The Institute of Internal Auditor defines consulting services as advisory and related client service activities, the nature and scope of which are agreed with the client and which are intended to add value and improve an organization's governance, risk management, and control processes without the internal auditor assuming management responsibility. Examples include counsel, advice, facilitation, and training. The nature of consulting services must be defined in the internal audit charter. When should consulting services be provided? Consulting services may be conducted as either part of the internal auditor's normal or routine activity or as a special request made by the management. Each organization must first consider the type of consulting activities to conduct and then determine the specific procedures to develop for each type of activity. What is the independence and objectivity requirement in consulting engagements? Internal auditors may provide consulting services relating to operations for which they had previous responsibilities. If internal auditors have potential impairments to independence or objectivity relating to proposed consulting services, the disclosure must be made to the engagement client before accepting the engagement. While internal auditors can provide consulting services relating to operations for which they had previous responsibilities, the auditor should still act independently and objectively. What is the due professional care requirement in consulting engagements? The chief audit executive must decline the consulting engagement or obtain competent advice and assistance from the internal auditors who lack the knowledge, skills, or other competencies needed to perform all or part of the engagement. What is the requirement of communicating the results of consulting engagements? Communication of the progress and results of consulting engagements will vary in form and content depending upon the nature of the engagement and the needs of the client. The chief audit executive is responsible for communicating the final results of consulting engagements to clients. During consulting engagements, governance, risk management, and control issues may be identified. Whenever these issues are significant to the organization, they must be communicated to the senior management and the board. What are financial and non financial benchmarks? Financial benchmarks use monetary values to make comparisons such as profitability, cost of production, and so forth. Non financial benchmarks, however, make comparisons using numerical factors such as the percentage of one time deliveries or the percentage of the satisfied customers. What are internal and external benchmarks? With internal benchmarks, a company compares its performance against its internal division, processes, functions, or departments. With external benchmarks, a company makes an external comparison, most commonly against a competitor. What is functional, competitive, and generic benchmark? A functional benchmark is a comparison with organizations that operate within the same technological area. A competitive benchmark is a comparison with the best of a company's competitors. A generic benchmark compares processes that are virtually the same, regardless of the industry or the production line. This type of benchmarking is not as helpful as a comparison of processes that are precisely the same. What does the Section 404 of the SOX require? Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act requires companies to include in their annual reports these two items. Number one, a statement of management's responsibility for establishing and maintaining adequate internal controls over financial reporting. Number two, an assessment of the effectiveness of those internal controls. What must management do to comply with the requirements of Section 404? Management must establish a formal internal control testing program to determine the extent to which the design and operation of activities in the control process are sufficient to prevent or detect and correct significant misstatements. What is the focus of internal control evaluation? The internal control evaluation should focus on establishing controls that adequately prevent or detect material misstatements in financial statements promptly. Who is responsible for coordinating internal audit efforts with other assurance providers? The Chief Audit Executive should share information, coordinate activities, and consider relying upon the work of other internal and external assurance and consulting service providers to ensure proper coverage and minimize duplication of efforts. Why is the coordination between internal and external auditors necessary? Coordination between external and internal auditors is essential for the following two reasons. Number one, internal auditing continues to become increasingly professionalized, with more internal auditors being full time internal auditors or former external auditors. As a result, the scope and quality of internal auditing have increased. Two, the cost of the external audit has risen, and therefore, companies are looking for ways to reduce expenses in this area. Having a definite, objective, and competent internal auditor means that the work of the external auditor can be better streamlined and thus less costly. What are the two things that must be considered by external auditors before relying on internal auditors? Before the external auditor relies on the internal auditor's work, he or she needs to assess the internal auditor's competence and objectivity. Competence is the measure of an internal auditor's skills and abilities to perform the acceptable work. Objectivity measures the internal auditor's capacity to work without any influence from management or others in the organization. Can internal auditors' working papers be shared with the external auditors? The Chief Audit Executive can provide copies of the internal audit working papers to the external auditor and others within the organization. However, the external auditor should not give the internal audit working papers to anyone without the permission of the internal auditor. Can internal auditors rely on the work of the assurance providers? The decision to rely on the work of other assurance providers can be made for a variety of reasons, including to address areas that fall outside of the competence of the internal audit activity, to gain knowledge transfer from other assurance providers, or to efficiently enhance coverage of risk beyond the internal audit plan. What is the purpose of KPIs on internal audit activity. Key performance indicators or the KPIs of the internal audit activity provides a platform to discuss issues related to the internal audit activity and potentially gain board support in making the necessary changes. The establishment of KPIs should be done in a group that includes senior management, board, and there should be a consensus that the KPIs chosen are meaningful and appropriate. Here comes the end of the Section A tutorial series. The candidates are requested to kindly complete all the 38 true-false questions from the study book. All the topics presented in this video has been taken from my CIA Part 2 Practice of Internal Auditing study book for 2020. The link to subscribe the same is mentioned in the description of the video. Please share your feedback, recommendation and comments. Have a nice day. Take care. Allah Hafiz.